You should never speak ill of the dead. Do you agree with that statement? I'm Robert J. Simpson. This is something I've wanted to talk about for quite a while now, and I think it's something that's really important. This is probably a video that's gonna cheese a few people off. And it's probably going to be a bit longer than usual because I've already tried to record it a couple of times to try and put my thoughts in place, and it's really difficult. But I wanted to talk about this because this is an expression that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It comes from the Latin de mortuis, nil nisi bonum dicendum est, of the dead. Nothing but good is to be said. So say nothing bad about the dead, basically. And it's something I struggle with quite a lot. It's something I've heard all my life. When people die, that we shouldn't say anything, and it's something that's used a lot whenever people speak out and say something that is slightly critical of somebody who is no longer here. And I get why it exists. It exists as an expression because you're trying to protect people who are not here to defend themselves. That makes perfect sense to me. I understand that. It's like having a one-sided court case where somebody else doesn't turn up, although that is also a possibility. And the problem is that is used then to silence people who actually have a reason for speaking up. And I have come in for some stick over the last week about this, specifically because I talked about the actor Nicholas Brendon and his abusive past. I got criticized for focusing on his documented domestic abuse. And having read lots and lots of comments from victims of his, I got criticized for that rather than focusing on, say, the acting that he did. And I was reminded that, he has family and friends who are grieving right now, and they don't need to see comments like mine. But the reality is, I think that everybody, including the worst people in the world, will have somebody out there who cares about them. They will have family, they will have friends who care about them and who don't want to hear any of that bad stuff. But also quite probably they have heard that bad stuff while they're alive, and they're very, very conscious of it. And in many instances may actually be complicit. They have been silent whilst that person has been alive, and in death they want to remain silent. They want everyone else to remain silent too, because it's an inconvenient truth to say something unpleasant about someone. But I also wonder if we have graduated responses to this, if there are certain crimes and certain people that we are allowed to speak out about. So maybe you're someone who agrees with this as a sentiment, except if somebody does a certain crime, if somebody has maybe a certain kind of politics, maybe that's a reason why you might want to speak out against them, because they didn't think the same way that you did about something. Or maybe it's a case of, like if they are someone who's a thief, we say nothing. But maybe if they were a murderer, it's okay to call them out for being a murderer, because that's a pretty serious crime and it's the taking of somebody else's life. And they clearly didn't care for other people's lives. Although we will make exceptions probably for people who kill in service as a soldier, but we won't for someone who does it maybe accidentally, manslaughter, or a car accident or whatever. It's a weird space. But also there are certain crimes, like if someone is a child molester, I think that most of us will probably call them out for being a child molester. Although I have seen a disgusting number of people who, when you make an allegation like that, or when allegations like this have been investigated and people have been prosecuted, they have said, oh, well, it's all a fit up. It's a whole other can of worms. I think of someone like Ian Watkins, who was a singer with the Lost Prophets and a child molester who was killed in prison not that long ago. And people were very, very happy to talk about the fact that he was now dead and had no qualms in calling him out on his atrocious, appalling, disgusting behaviour. So there's clearly a sort of standard there. But people like Watkins as well are celebrities. So people like Watkins or Rolf Harris or people like that, or politicians. They are people who are in the public eye. They're regularly doing stuff that is performative, that is seen, and they live their lives through a lens that means that we see them, we talk about them anyway. And I think it's fair that if you have lived that kind of life, that you've courted the press, that there is this element of your life is under slightly more scrutiny, and when you die, that it's fair that something is commented on. I happen to have worked for media in the past. And one of the things that I have had to do, is to give sort of eulogies for people on the radio and online and places like that whenever someone has died. And like, you try and get a balance for someone's life, but if they have done something that is bad, you can't talk about them and not talk about the bad things. I think of an actor I love, for example, like Oliver Reed. Fantastic actor, amazing talent, but that man did horrible things, had a history of domestic abuse, had struggled with alcohol addiction as well, and you cannot talk about it. Was one of the hellraisers of the 60s, and you can't talk about someone like that without acknowledging and addressing that side of him too. The same is true of a lot of rock stars, a lot of performers, that we have to kind of like draw that kind of comparison. But I think that there is this sort of, there are certain crimes that people commit that people kind of turn a blind eye to, and something like domestic abuse is a crime that I think far too many people gloss over. Here in Northern Ireland at the moment, we're having a conversation, a very open conversation about the attitudes towards violence against women, and how Northern Ireland's actually the least safe place in the UK, statistically, for women, because of the murders that have gone on. And when you're in that kind of environment, it's really disturbing to kind of hear people just kind of gloss over it, to kind of shame victims for speaking out. And I think it's victims that are kind of central to this, because we can acknowledge that family and friends care about someone, and they probably know about the things that they did while they were alive and are kind of still turning a blind eye to it. And we know that fans of celebrities sometimes have a difficulty connecting or addressing the fact that they might love someone's work, but the person themselves was a really toxic human being and they did horrible things. And that is kind of important, because often the biography informs how we read the work. And it's like almost like you're sort of saying, well, if I like that person, they did bad things, then I must myself be a bad person. Although that's not actually quite how it works. And so what they do is they kind of try and shoot you down whenever you say something else. And that's what I've had this week, as I've had people who tell me I shouldn't say things, that I'm just commenting on it because I want to get hits or likes or comments or whatever. And that's not the case. This is something that I feel very, very strongly about, particularly domestic abuse. I think it's something that we cannot hide. And if that is something that you have done repeatedly, as in the case of Brendon, if that's something you've repeatedly been arrested for, that there are court cases about, that there are still victims out there who are talking about it, that you have to address that whenever you sum up someone's life. And everyone else a lot of other places are focusing on him as an actor. So I think there's a space there for someone like me to talk about the other side of things and create an awareness about it. And the reason for talking about it immediately after someone dies as well is because an issue like that is very serious. And by talking about it, there is a chance that other people who are not aware will actually be able to discuss it too. And other people who've been similarly affected can talk about what it's like for them. And the reality is that victims are often left without justice whenever their abuser dies, and they may need to talk about it. And I say this as somebody who is a survivor of domestic abuse. I was in an abusive relationship for a number of years. I have talked about this ever since I was in the middle of it. In various forms. I talked about it while I was in it. I talked about it while I was getting out of the relationship. I talked about it while I was being harassed afterwards, and in the years after, as I've dealt with my trauma. I've done a lot of therapy on it. I've done a lot of work. I have tried to find my way through, but also I was silenced a lot of the time by people who felt that I shouldn't say anything. Also a libel system that made it difficult to say certain things. And I fully acknowledge that my abuser had family and friends who cared about them, who, some of whom know nothing about what went on, like genuinely know nothing. But there are other people there who did know what was going on at the time and who turned a blind eye to it. And I struggle with that. I still struggle with that because, their love for them was more important than what they were actually doing. And that's difficult. And for a lot of abusers, they need to find a chance to speak out. And that is really, really difficult. And I had this strange situation last year where my abuser died very suddenly. I haven't had contact with him for well over a decade. And it was a mutual friend that reached out. And yeah, surprisingly, I still have a couple of mutual friends with them. I'm not sure all of them are aware that that's who that we had that connection to begin with. But I trying to find the words for this. I was overcome by a lot of different emotions whenever she died. I would never get the closure that I needed, because while she was alive, she denied that she had abused me in any way, shape, or form. This is in spite of several court orders, police reports, and an abundance of evidence that I had gathered that support my case. She's always denied it. And like many abusers, tried to turn everything around. I mean, at one point this played out quite publicly online. And that was very difficult too. And she's not a celebrity, so whenever she died, I tried to not say very much, because I needed to get my head in gear. I've always found it easier talking about somebody else's situation or experiences than kind of dealing with this one, because this was a moment that I never thought I'd find myself in. This was somebody I loved once upon a time, that I cared about, that I used to fight for, tried to get them to a better place. This is somebody who was dealing with their own demons, but who made my life a living misery for the time I was with them, who abused me physically, mentally, emotionally, sexually, and left me a wreck of myself, still trying to deal with the consequences of that all these years later. And I've talked about this before, so I don't mind that I'm putting this out in another long video that half a dozen people will watch today. When someone dies who has done bad things, you do not get, in my opinion, you should not get a free pass in your memory just because you're dead. Because the reality is that these bad people who do bad things, people who are abusive, and I'm not talking about someone who does one bad thing, because we're all human beings and we all do bad things, but somebody who is repeatedly abusive and toxic and horrible and violent and shows no sense of remorse, no sense of accountability. When you are someone that is like that, I don't think that you deserve to get a free pass in your memory. I think that people like me who are still living with that have a right to express our frustration and our anger and our upset and our emotions just as much as your family and friends do that care about you and choose to ignore all of that. And I'm not saying that those things don't exist, that those people have no right to care about you because they knew a different part of you. That's fine. But those of us that are left behind, those of us who have suffered that, are allowed to talk about it, are allowed to feel the things that we feel. And my gosh, if that means calling it out, that means calling it out. And I've not hidden the identity of my abuser from family and friends. But because she wasn't somebody who is well known publicly, and because they have a family who, well, specific family members who I've deferred out of respect to them from going into everything, but I am still struggling with it. It's been a while now since she passed, and I am still trying to find the voice to talk about it. So when somebody else comes along who does these things, who is in the public eye, who there is a list of things that we can call out. Yeah, I'm going to call out. I'm going to say that this was somebody who might have been a great actor, but they were an abusive personality who did terrible things and they had no accountability, and that's not good. And that maybe we should stop giving people who are abusive a free pass just because they're famous, or just because it's only domestic abuse and it's not a real serious crime like murder. Because if that's your attitude, there is a fundamental problem with it. Yeah, I have lots of thoughts on this. I mean, this is a 14-minute video already. I'm going to leave it here, but I have more to say. I just don't know what format that's going to be. I might have to write something rather than kind of do a talk. But if you're interested, you want to talk about it, you've got thoughts, share it with me. I'm going to stick this out there and see what happens. And, you know, I may lose followers as a result of it. But this has been part of my life for far too long. And I refuse to be silenced. Thanks for listening.